white. That's a huge difference. And the store being in the east side of town, not in the unincorporated valley, means we tend to see a lot of very privileged people. And while a lot of people, especially here and now, do volunteer work and try to bring literacy and education and all kinds of wonderful things to the rest of our neighbors, it's something always to keep in mind. In the kid-lit community, I'm also the children's buyer, so this is dear to my heart. There's a sentiment that you need books that are mirrors. You need to have books that you can see yourself in. But you also need books that are windows. You need to be able to see out of your own experience and see what other people's experiences are. So if you guys want to take that spirit of mirrors and windows, Arlene's going to run with that. Okay.
Thank you.
That's very nice.
Well, I'd like to thank you all for coming. And I'd like to thank you especially for welcoming Al Camarillo to Sonoma. Al is a good friend, and I met Al through his wife, Susan. Susan was the counselor at the school where I worked. And if you were as blessed, as fortunate as I was, those with whom you worked became much more than colleagues. They and their families became lifelong friends. And so it is with the Camarillos. Al is regarded as a founding scholar in the field of Mexican-American history and Chicano studies. In 1975, he earned his doctorate at UCLA, and he was the first Mexican-American to earn a PhD in American history with a specialization in Chicano history. In 1975, Al began his teaching career at Stanford, and he is the only faculty member in the history of Stanford to have won 6 awards for excellence in teaching and service to the university. He's written 8 books and dozens of articles on Mexican Americans and on other communities of color. His memoir, Compton and My Soul, a life in pursuit of racial equality. I got it. I know. It took me long enough. Okay. That was published in July of this year. But prior to its release, the Los Angeles Times book review section had a great review about Al's book, and it received a lot of traction. Thereafter, the Times also published another article about Al, about his visit back to Compton to speak to the youth of that community. Coincidentally, a few weeks ago, in our Press Democrat Sunday supplement, the article that had been in the Los Angeles Times was republished. And if the rumor mill is correct, there was an interview about Al this morning on KPIX. So without any further ado, I would like to welcome my dear friend, Dr. Albert Camarillo.
Thank you, Arlene. That was special. I'm going to make her my agent next time. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Readers Books for hosting this. Arlene's done a wonderful job. I know there's friends here, there are book club members, and there are dear friends from Hillsborough schools, and I will identify them. Karen, right there. Janet, with Arlene, and this woman sitting in front of me, I don't know her. My wife Susan. And Michelle, where are you, Michelle? Michelle over here. I did a rough calculation. These phenomenal educators have a combined 100+ years in that school district, right? And we're phenomenal. So it's wonderful to have you here, a little retreat, right? So thank you all for coming. I've been giving book talks up and down the state, and one of the questions that inevitably will be posed, why did you write a memoir? Well, I could understand why they ask that. Historians, academics, don't normally write autobiographies or memoir. That's not a genre we're used to. We write for other colleagues and for students in our classes. But my response, and I'll give you a few of those reasons of why I felt compelled to write this book. One, it was a pandemic. I didn't have anything else to do. Right? I mean, that helped, right? Because we were home, and a book that originally was conceived as an academic study turned into a personal memoir. One of the reasons was I have grandchildren. We have grandchildren, and their experiences are so vastly different from my generation. I want them to know, and I wanted the younger generation to know about this. So the grandchildren, the book is actually dedicated to the grandchildren. But I wanted to tell stories about the hope and progress made in building a more just and tolerant nation of which we are all a part. Because in those of us that are in our 60s and 70s, we can mark change. And I do that in this book. And I also wanted to leave for this younger generation, aside from the grandchildren, the young people coming of age in 21st century America, especially the kids of color and the sons and daughters of immigrants, that they can read a story about how higher education and opportunity can transform their life. It certainly did that for me. I also want to tell stories about this place that a lot of people refer to as the CPT, Compton, right? And I wanted to add a new narrative, because there's a basic narrative, maybe two narratives about this place where I was born and raised. It's an African-American ghetto. It's infested by gangs, a crack cocaine epidemic, violence is endemic. That's one narrative. The other is Serena and Venus Williams as young girls who played on the courts, right? By their dad, who was overseeing everything on these litter-strewn public tennis courts. Or if you're into hip hop, you know about gangster rap, and you know about some of the famous hip hop artists that come out of Compton. The stories I tell about Compton include that, but I'm telling another narrative in the last part of the book about hope and about young people that are coming of age and trying to do things to make that community whole again, and a functional community beyond the problems that's plaguing it. But I think finally, one of the key reasons for me, I wanted people to read about this Mexican kid that comes out of Compton. And with opportunity and with the opportunity to go to college, as among the first ever of my people, right? We're not admitted to universities. And how that can have such an enormous effect. And it always makes me think too about, it was something that I experienced that the generation before me could not have dreamt of, right? It was beyond their imagination. That I could be a part of, again with good fortune and opportunity, to see something that I think is really profound. A major institution in American society. Stanford University, you know what that means. But higher education in general, go from an institution highly segregated, right? When I was a kid, when I was a student at UCLA, highly racially segregated institution of society. And over the course of 45 years that I was at that institution, I was only ever at one university, it was Stanford, that I could be a part of and help build a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural institution where a diversity of people could live together, work together harmoniously, collaboratively in building what I think is an example of the best of what we are as a nation. that we are a racially diverse nation that's had enormous divides, but my experience tells it's possible, right? So there's a message of hope in there, and heaven knows we need it right now. And lastly, it's a message about social change. Right? I've lived long enough, many of us have lived long enough to see the changes, some of the positive changes that have occurred, and I felt it was my obligation to record that. Right? So those are some of the reasons. I could give you others, but you can ask me. You can ask me later. We're going to have ample time. But after the talk. So what I would like to do is share some stories with you, right? That are embedded in the book, and they're gonna move from time and space. So I'll jump from one place to the other with these stories. Okay? So bear with me if there seems to be a little incongruity of these. First, let me start. This is 1983. We're at Stanford. We're raising our family now, right? So a little home in Menlo Park, and we have our two boys. Jeff is about 4, and our son Greg is a little guy. He's about 1 year old. And as parents, those of you parents, you put the kids in front of the television, or you're preparing something in the kitchen. And I was in the kitchen. I forget where Susan was. She was doing something else elsewhere in the household. And I knew that because he was watching a lot of Sesame Street, right? And I kind of subliminally heard these messages about ethnic diversity. And if you remember the cast of Sesame, it was diverse, right? It was pretty amazing that in in the early 80s, kids like our son Jeff was watching this stuff about ethnic diversity and seeing it projected on a TV screen. So one day, he comes up to me, and you can tell sometimes when a 3 or 4 year old is going to say, they don't say stuff profoundly to you very often, right? So he comes up and he walks up to me, and his chest is kind of puffed out, and he looks me straight in the eye and says, "Dad, I'm proud to be Japanese American." I said, "Come here, son, we got it." And I of course that's but I spent more time after that looking at those messages. As I thought about, as a historian of race and ethnic relations in American society, it made me think about a generational shift. Something that would have been unheard of when I was his age. In fact, it made me, I'll tell you another story. It made me think about ethnic background and ethnic pride. So I'm going to take you some years earlier. I was 1957. We moved to a new location of Compton, in South Compton, predominantly white community, but there was some diversity there. But I went to the 3rd grade, and I'm like 3-4 weeks into the 3rd grade of this new school, and it's the first time that I had been outside this cocoon of the Mexican American community, the Mexican American daughter in Compton, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a few minutes. And so here I'm in this classroom, and it's predominantly white kids, and we were studying missions. You got, those of you who grew up in California, you had to build a little mission, and you had, whatever you did, right? It was California history. And somehow, with this little group that I was with, someone raised the question of, who are you? What are you? And so we sat in this little circle, and this girl over here says, "Oh, I'm Irish." And this other boy over here, "I'm German." And there was another little girl, and she says, "I'm Jewish." And I didn't know what that meant. I was 9 years old. Later I did. Then it came to me. And I looked around. I'm Spanish.
Of course.
I didn't say I was Mexican. Why didn't I say I was Mexican? All right, let's go back a little further. So I was born into a community in the north central part of Compton that was a highly segregated community of Mexican people. The only people allowed to live in Compton before 1945-ish, 46, were white folks, a few Japanese farmers that lived in the periphery. It was once a farming community, and the Mexican folks that were given one little portion of Compton to live in. My family were among the first immigrants to settle there. And only later, as I became a historian and realized how that happened and understood the nature of residential segregation, that redlining was pervasive by the 1920s everywhere in Los Angeles and most municipalities and metropolitan areas across the country, right? So it contained people. But for me, there were two things, right? Yes, it was a segregated community, but as a kid, I didn't understand. I had a tío and a tía and a abuela, an uncle, an aunt, a grandmother, other people, a padrino over here. It was an insular, small Mexican community of about 1,000 people. And I never had to think about ethnic identity because I knew I was Mexican. Right? And within that insular community, that was fine, right? We were happy to be Mexican Americans. But outside of that community, as I learned as a historian, being Mexican was not a good thing. And the nature of discrimination, the nature of segregation in the schools, in the marketplace, in the jobs, everywhere, right? It was the largest minority population in the state of California. When I grew up in Compton, small community, there were 650,000 Mexican Americans just north of us. In central Los Angeles and East Los Angeles, huge communities of Mexican folks. And just north of Compton was another 600,000 African Americans contained in well-defined communities because basically, we were talking about this earlier. That time, pre-50s, there were places you simply couldn't live if you were a person of color, right? But that community was important for me because it gave me the foundation of a stability and a consciousness of being a person, even if, as I was interacting more and more with a diversity of people in Compton and elsewhere, I had that foundation, right? I had that sense of being connected to a community that was, for my well-being, really important. So we moved from Milwaukee in 1957 because we lived next door to the Little Catholic Church. The Little Catholic Church, by the way, that was the Mexican church because we could not go to the Catholic Church on the east side of Compton, pre-50s. The church decided to build a bigger church because the Mexican community was growing and they wanted to buy our property. If you're a good Catholic, you don't say no to the Catholic Church. So we sold our house and we went to South Central Compton. It's called Richland Farms. When I started the school there, it was overwhelmingly white. In 5 years, it was overwhelmingly black. Why? Laws were created in the state of California and elsewhere that did not allow redlining anymore, and it was discriminatory, right? And it was illegal to not allow people to buy into neighborhoods. Black folks, middle class, professional folks were now moving from South Central Los Angeles, and Compton was their target, right? Because this was the place that had good schools, nice homes, middle class and working class homes, right? So to move from the concentrated African American neighborhoods that were deteriorating to a place like Compton was a huge step up. It's the nature of our society. As soon as they came in, the whites left. And this is true across America, right? In the 50s and 60s. For me, though, in a way, it was an amazing blessing because I was there as I transitioned from a Mexican community to having white Mexican friends, white friends, and then black friends. Almost entirely by the time I was in 9th grade at Walton Junior High School. Every single one of my relationships with friends was with an African American. And they brought me into that community. Right? To this day, Motown's my favorite music. Right? So culturally at that time for middle school, you guys know this about middle school, it's really formative, right? And so that experience was really important. But a problem occurs. I'm expected to go to Compton High School like all my brothers and sisters, right? Compton High School is overwhelmingly African American by that time. There's a high school built in East Compton as Compton's transitioning, and lo and behold, it's for the white kids, like mostly white kids. But I'm going to Compton High School, like all my brothers and sisters, and then one day, my sister, my oldest sister, who was the boss of the family, love her dearly, but you know, she called shots and convinced my parents to do what she thought was best. I didn't realize this at the time when I was told, Mom and Dad sold the house, and we're moving to the edge of East Compton, and you're going to Dominguez High School. That was the white high school. I said, no. I ain't going to Dominguez. I'm going to school with my friends. You don't win those battles when you're 15 years old. Years later, you know, usually they don't tell you the reasons until you heard. She thought I was becoming too black. She wanted me to have white friends. And I did. I went to that school, and I had a whole new group of friends, and it was a new racial experience for me. But I didn't know how it was going to turn out. Another story. I'm at this new school. I don't know a soul, right? I know, well, not true. 2 weeks before school starts, the football team assembles, and I was a football player. And you know, I worked playing with these guys, and 2 weeks before school, so I know met several of the football players, but I didn't know anyone else, right? 2 weeks into the semester, I get summoned by the vice principal. You do not want to be summoned by the vice principal. I'm not real smart, but I knew that much. And he calls me out of English class. I said, cussing, oh shit, what are we here? And so he sits me down, Mr. Joseph, stern guy, right? And he says, welcome to Dominguez, Al. Now, here my leg is shaking. When I get nervous, my leg shakes. And he said, welcome to Dominguez. We know you were the vice president of the student body at Walton Junior High School. And we know you were Mr. Brotherhood. There was an award in the 9th grade, which they resurrected, think about the time, 1963, to promote interracial harmony. Well, I was Mr. Brotherhood. They said, we also know that you were honored by the Rotary Club. How does this guy know this stuff? Right? And then the kicker. We want you to run for sophomore class president. 2 weeks, I don't know a soul. And I told him, no one knows me. But I ran for president. And I won. Now, you may have heard this before. I think that election was rigged. Does that sound familiar? But you know what it was, and I wonder whether it was conspiratorial, right? But it integrated me further into that community. My best friends were all the white kids. My teammates were the white kids. Small Mexican, maybe 30 Mexican kids in school. Not one African American, right? Sophomore year. Telescope 2 years later. Compton Unified School District decides it must desegregate, like so many schools, right? They're busing the black kids over. The principal and the vice principal call me in and say, look, we're going to form a human relations council, and we want you to chair it. And I understood why. Fights were breaking out every morning between the black kids and the white kids. And I knew a lot of the black kids because they were 7th graders when I was a 9th grader at Walton, right? So, but I was 17 years old. How was I going to chair a human relations council? But I did my best I could, although I have to confess to you, I held one meeting I thought was useful for people to kind of talk, but there was still a lot of tension. And then there was one session in the library. I don't think I actually organized, I don't remember organizing it, but I chaired it. And they brought an African American girl, there were three girls, an African-American girl, a Mexican-American girl, and a white girl. They talked about, you know, civil rights and things, and I remember, and here's the confession. The black girl said something to the effect, slavery was the reason why we're having so many troubles today and in history. Right? It was slavery. And as ignorant as I was, please forgive me for saying this. If you read this book, young lady, now you're old, please forgive me. I said, that was 100 years ago. What did slavery have to do with it? And this is the future historian. All right, fast forward. 1966. I'm one of 50 Mexican Americans at the University of California, Los Angeles, out of 27,500 students. Pre-affirmative action, right? I think they let me in by mistake, but I was a basketball player. Pardon me. Funny thing about that, as my students at Stanford learned that I played basketball at UCLA, they said, "You played basketball?" "Yeah, I played with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and all those." They said, "You played?" I said, "Yes, I was once 6'10", but as you get older, the body." And they would say, "Really?" The students could be very gullible. So here I was, a Mexican kid. There's only 100 black kids at UCLA at this time, right? So again, affirmative action. And the anchor for me was basketball because I was struggling mightily academically. Compton, Dominguez High, Compton Unified School did not prepare us to compete with some of these incredibly smart kids from the West Side. And it took me a couple of years before I found history. That really kind of saved me. And I found ethnic studies that kind of saved me. And they were the second most important thing that I found at UCLA. There's the first thing. All right, so to tell you what a big impact I had on Susan was we met as freshmen. One day, I was going with one of my teammates, and he invited us over his apartment close to UCLA, and we come in the door, and there's this pretty girl that's sleeping with like a book in her lap. She was obviously reading and fell asleep. And I look in and I say, "John," my teammate said, "John, you come home, man? There's a pretty girl waiting for you right here." He said, I told him, "Sign me up, John," because I wasn't that girl yet at UCLA. I made such a big impression on her, she doesn't remember that encounter. But luckily, the next year, I was able to be successful. And this woman is one of the huge reasons why I was successful in life and in a career, because she was there with me the entire time. My main editor, right? My main editor, she's read everything, including this book, right? Including this book, so you know, over everything. Ethnic studies and history. My students love this, by the way. When they found out that I was on academic probation, a Stanford professor on academic probation. Yes, I was struggling until I found history that opened my eyes during think about the years, 67, 68, 69, for those of you of my generation, right? And how profound the things that were happening in our society could make you turn one way or the other, right? But now I have this advantage of being educated and the opportunity to engage in the study of history and take the first Mexican-American history course ever offered in the University of California system in 1969, the first African-American course ever offered in the University of California system, 1969, and the first course on the history of racial attitudes, and boom, that light went on. And a couple faculty took me under their wing. They saw that I had potential, and it changed my life. Hi. Lucky to get a job at Stanford University, right? Affirmative action baby, I call myself. Would have never got there. Had it not been for affirmative action, I would have never had the opportunity to go to Stanford, right? And to see if I could sink or swim. And I was committed to helping to create a new body of historical literature about a group, Mexican Americans, other Latinos, and other people of color whose stories had never been told or rarely told. Right? So that became my life work. But I knew at the same time that because I was a historian and a person of color, I had an obligation. I couldn't just be a professor. I just couldn't be the teacher. That was a lot, right? I was teaching kids and I knew I was having an impact on hundreds and later thousands of kids. But I knew that the place had to change. And when I was given the opportunity with other folks to help change that institution, I was committed to it, right? I was committed to it. Because I knew, I began to realize they were serious about making it a place of diversity. The number of students of color had dramatically increased by the late 80s, but so too its intentions. It happened everywhere in American higher education, institutions of higher education. They had experimented, they had brought in diverse student body, but they hadn't done enough to facilitate an understanding so that there was mutual respect and appreciation that allow this diverse group of students to interact well, effectively. So it blew up at Stanford too. 1988, 1989. Really bad incidents, right? Highly racialized incident. Blew the top off the university's sides. It's better do something about it to rethink what it's going to do. Like a lot of institutions across the country were doing the same thing. How are we going to make this racially democratic society that we've now constructed, to make it work, to make it functional, to make it a place where we can all work together and learn together, right? So I get tapped by the president and the provost, and I'm still an associate professor, about 45 years old. But I knew it was an opportunity, because these opportunities don't come often. And when you're a historian, it gives you a sense of timing and possible significance. You don't know what you're going to do is going to make a difference, but I knew that the university, the president and the provost and the deans and others were serious about it. So I put a year and a half of my time into doing this University Committee on Minority Issues. 250-page report. But we knew as a committee, big committee, that if we could get this right with a lot of research, right? So we did a year of research. We surveyed a huge number of undergraduate students, graduate students, staff, and faculty, and it laid a blueprint for what that institution was going to do for the next 20 years. And a lot of it worked. Some of it didn't work, but a lot of it worked. And when I see a president like he will be installed, the new president, articulating that at the core of its mission, that a place like Stanford is committed to being an institution, a multiracial institution that is the best of who we are as a society, as a multiracial society, that's really amazing, right? And that gives me hope. One of the reasons why I wrote the book, right? Because I wanted to give hope to especially younger people. All right, one last story. This one here. We're about ready to finish the report, and I'm working day and night on this thing, and I'm writing, babies due. Right? Babies due. Our daughter is due. She wasn't supposed to be born for a couple weeks, and she was saying, I think something's happening. I said, please, I'm almost finished with the report. Can you wait a couple days? Can you believe I said that? I apologize. And what did she do? She waited 2 days, and I finished reporting the guy. And something else that I'll mention to you that as I thought about this book, as I was writing it, thinking about a long career, about week after Kamala Harris got the nod, right, from Joe Biden, that she was going to be the presidential candidate for the Democratic Party. I listened to a speech that she did, and in that speech, what resonated with me most in that speech, she talked about 5 freedoms. The freedom for a woman to have control over her body, the freedom from fear. But the thing that just jolted me, she said, the freedom to have the true history and knowledge about our diverse society, something to that effect. 30 years ago, no president would have said that. Certainly, when I was a young man, no president could have ever said that. That's change. That's hope. Now we'll talk about the other side, because that's taking us back, right? To the worst impulses that we have as a people and as a nation, and they're being contested. Right? So this book and the stories I tell, there's hundreds of stories embedded in this. It's a book about hope, right? It's a book about change. It's a book that I'm hoping will inspire some younger people as they think about education and opportunity in our society and how it can be a better society, because I've seen the good things that can happen here. I've been part of an institution that can change for the good, and if it gets to those students, and I'm beginning to hear from them, which just warms my heart. Young people writing me, emailing me with almost every day. It brings tears to my eyes what they're saying when they read this thing. It gives them hope, and they're inspired to do things in our society. Right? So the time that went into writing this different kind of book, I've never written anything in the first person, was the time was well spent, and I hope those of you that get a chance to read the book, or those of you that have read portions of it, you'll begin to see some of those stories, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you so much. Now, we have plenty of time
Open up for questions.
for questions, absolutely.
Any questions?
So anything goes, anything goes. Yes.
Okay, so you have 3 children. I'm wondering what their experience of discrimination is compared to your experience of discrimination.
That's a good question. Did you hear that in the back? Okay. It's a generational change, but there are still things that tell us they linger across generation, right? They're highly educated, all 3 of them professionals, right? We sent them to public schools, a diverse public school. Our oldest son tended to gravitate to African American community, right? So his best friends, almost all of his best friends are African American. And where were those kids coming to Menlo Atherton High School? From East Palo Alto, historically segregated black community. That was also becoming Latino community. Right? So he saw it early on, right? But he knew he had, I think early on he realized it, certainly when he became educated. Went far away to the University of Pennsylvania, and then realized through education, but not unlike his parents, that he understood how that happened, right? Our second son was a football player, so some of his best friends were African American as well, right? And then he played in the NFL for 8 years with a large number of African Americans, right? So he too knew he had a privileged upbringing, right? Menlo Park, upper middle class, nice community right next to Stanford University. He went to Stanford University, but when he starts understanding the experiences of his African American friends, and his Tongan friend, and another friend of color, Latino kid, all from East Palo Alto, right? And our daughter did the same thing. Now, she didn't have as many African American Latino friends. She was a dancer. She is a dancer. And so she didn't have that same experience. But I know this now. What's so wonderful for us as parents is that though we didn't jam it down their throats about diversity, it's embedded in who they are, right? And it's one of the core values of who they are as people. The offshoot of that, our grandchildren, I'll name this way, Tongan, Japanese, German, Irish, Mexican, Jewish, and African American, right? So, California. You know, and that's something also to say is that we live in a state that is, you know, it is the most diverse human, it's the greatest diversity of humankind ever anywhere on the planet, right? And so in a sense, we're an experiment too. And if we can make it work, and do it in lots of ways, we make it work, that this species that we belong to can overcome these enormous historic divides, that's an amazing accomplishment. Right? But realizing that it's enormous work across the generations. Long-winded, but I hope that gets.
What did you say to the one who was Japanese?
Yeah, probably Japanese. Yes.
What you're given the election is coming in a short period of time, arguably the biggest elections many of us have lived through. What's your take on the Hispanic population and people of color population, people of color who have supported Donald Trump? And I struggle to understand how Hispanic Americans, particularly given the gold escalator speech about Mexicans, some of whom might be okay. You know, what's your take on that?
That's a good question. And a lot of people ask that question, right? Because on the surface, you say, wait a minute, this is largely an immigrant origin population, right? Largely a working class population that over time lived in segregated neighborhoods, et cetera, right? Much of, as I explained, told stories about and are embedded, stories embedded in the book, it's a complicated population. You have to sort it out multiple ways to understand why you have a substantial Republican segment that supports Trump, right? First thing you do, you disaggregate that population by national origin. Cuban, long history, right, of Republican connection there. And that's true over a generation, less so for the younger Cuban Americans than their parents or grandparents. Puerto Ricans, more a Democratic-based population, but there's been inroads into the second and third generation whose parents came over in the early 20th century, further removed from the immigrant experience. Mexican-American population, of course, been here forever, right? So you have to look at it not only when that immigration occurred, right? The largest immigration from Mexico occurred in the 80s and 90s and into the first few years of this century. My dad's generation was the largest up to that time. It was the first great wave, and there have been 4 generations since. So you start dissecting that population, and you have to do it by generation, right? It's still overwhelmingly a working class population. It's still largely Catholic, and that's a drag on issues, right? That abortion, right? That's a huge drag. And then the historical. So if you've had a population, at least for this population, that was outside the arena of politics for a long, long time, there's not that historic connection like African Americans, for example, right? Or through Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Movement in the South and elsewhere, that tied them to the Democratic Party, so that you get 85% of African Americans today supporting Harris, right, for all kinds of reasons. But only maybe 60% of Latinos, right? Trump took another 5-7% that first election for his, right? It dumbfounds me because I'd like just to knock them on the head and say, let me tell you a few things about this man and his party now. It's not the GOP that we, so many of us knew at one point, right? It's a very different party, completely different party. But those things die hard, right? And it's hard to convince those folks. One, they need to vote, they need to register to vote, and they need to think about the future and their children, right? So the simple answer, it's complicated. You look by national origin, by generation, and other things that are going to give you clues why there's greater or lesser orientation to conservatism or liberalism. And I'm praying that 40% edges up into, that 60% edges up into 65% or so for this election, because they're saying in 5 of the 7 swing states, Latino vote may determine the outcome, right? So we're talking about enormous influence, right? Any other questions? Any fair game? Anything? Yes.
Well, just as I tried to read this book before I got here and failed, I also meant to look up the history of the changes in, affirmative action that I know have changed since you were able to take advantage of it. I wondered if you could explain the changes that have taken place and what you think of them.
Well,
As far as college.
Yeah. So if you reduce the idea of affirmative action to an idea, the idea of how do you take people that have been excluded, underrepresented, have suffered from generations of discrimination, how do you bring them into the center of society possibly? How do you create opportunity, right? And the government really had never done that on the basis of race. And so they came up with a flawed plan, right? Affirmative action was a flawed plan. The idea was a good one, and it morphed over time. There were problems in how it was implemented. It wasn't universally implemented in higher education properly. Some places it worked very well, other places not so much. There were legal contestations of it, right? When some institutions did quotas, that's illegal, right? So that, and over time, it was clear the Supreme Court was telling America that this is going to be a time-limited policy, and indeed, it wasn't. The Supreme Court struck it down. But it still leaves us with the question of, are we a better society when we can figure out ways to give people opportunity? And how? How do we give them opportunity? Right? Education, of course, has been one of those keys, right? How do we make that a cornerstone of our democracy, that there's opportunity regardless of your socioeconomic or the color of your skin, right? And so I think it's still a fundamental question we're dealing with. And I'll say though, and there, you know this, those of you who are very literate and educated people here, there's enormous backlash across the red states. The elimination, for example, in Florida, the entire apparatus of what you could call the child of affirmative action. It's called diversity, equity, and inclusion. The governor and the legislature said no more. And they funded, they fired thousands of people and eliminated it from the entire system of higher education in the state of Florida. And there are like 6 or 7 other states that are planning to do the same. So yes, it's contested, and there are efforts to undermine whatever progress has been made. So it's a continuing issue that we're going to see a lot of play, a lot of policy discussion. Yes.
First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for being here. And thank you for making this possible. I actually majored in Chicano Latino studies also, and without someone like you, it would not be possible for me to have visibility. I actually work at a nonprofit in town, and our nonprofit is the Youth Center, and we provide resources for the Latino community within Sonoma County. and I guess I've been going through like this leadership program, and my question or it would be like, what's your advice to continue to have that hope for a community, to continue to build a community, the community inclusivity of this?
Bless your heart. Bless your heart. Thank you for being there like that. It's through efforts of people like you that change occurs. You know, you get educated, you take responsibility, you have a commitment, and when you work with kids especially, you see that change, and that's what keeps you going. You make linkages with everyone that comes across your path that supports what you do, and you build alliances. And if you need more education, you go after that education, right? And there are people that will help you. And there are hundreds of thousands of young people like you everywhere that I go. And that's what gives me hope. You give me hope. I visited with a bunch of kids in Compton with an organization called Color Compton. And it's developing, promoting art and history among the Black and Latino youth of that city. And nonprofit organization changing lives, right? Changing lives. And that's an intergenerational project, right? I was lucky because there were some people, a few pioneers before me that advocated to open up doors so that a person like me could go to college, right? And have opportunity. And it's constant work. Give yourself a break now and then because it's hard work. It's hard work, but it's God's work, you know. It really is. I'm not a religious person, but I call it God's work because in it there's things about things that come from all our religious traditions that are the best of who we are as a species of people, right? And helping others is part of it. So keep up the work. When you get tired, take a rest and get right back at it, right?
Thank you.
Yes.
I have a question. Do you ever get white students coming into your classroom asking about white pride? And what would you say to someone who's wondering about ethnic pride as whiteness when we have so much, discrimination in the creation of whiteness? What do you say to people who think that?
Good question. I didn't get, I've taught thousands and thousands of students. I don't think any student came in and asked me, what about my white pride? Because my job as a historian and educator was to influence all students and educate them about how did we develop these perceptions and attitudes that separate us by class and race and gender, and to equip them with the skills so as they come of age, they can answer that question for themselves, right? When they know that there were structures of ideas that came from Europe, were embedded in the institutions of the United States and other societies that separated people by the way they looked, whether they were free and unfree, by gender, women, right? Transgender people, LGBT. So these things, if you can equip, and this is the beauty of being an educator, those of you that are educators here, when you can, we had this conversation there earlier, when you can equip them with those skills to be able to assess things for themselves, you're doing your job. And then they can answer that question. Yes?
I'd just like to tell you how widely and more recently redlining has been a part of the nation, spoken broadly. So I'm Jewish, and in 1980 I went to buy a house in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And the University of Michigan is in Ann Arbor, right? 80% of the population is engaged in some way with the university. So you would expect it to be, in 1980, very diverse, very accepting, have wiped out any residue of things like redlining. So I'm going to get my loan, and I'm starting to sign, and then before I sign off that I have to read these CC&Rs, right, that go along with the housing. I forgot what CC&R even stands for, but the community regulations of the sort. And I'm reading through, and suddenly this paragraph.
Came down to the bottom of the document.
Somewhere, right, the second page, fine letters, somewhere it says, and no, you are not allowed to sell a house in this neighborhood to blacks, Jews, or gypsies. And I look at the attorney who's sitting there, I said, I can't sign this. what is this? I said, oh, it's just, you know,
It's
we
a
just.
historical document.
Historical document. No one, you know, it doesn't have any legal standing anymore. And so I just crossed things out, you know, initial things. And then we're on site, 1980.
It's a historical relic, and if any of you would look at those documents, almost every one of them is going to have that clause, right? It's usually at the end of towards the end of the document. And, you know, I did a lot of work looking at these across the country. And typically, those documents, there would be something to the effect, you remember that, this property can be sold to, and then there was a line, but not to, or something like, with a line, and you wrote in the group.
Really?
So depending where you were, right? San Francisco, Chinese, way back when, right? African American, of course, almost everywhere. Mexicans in a place like Los Angeles and in Texas. Jews in a lot of cities, right? And then gypsies is a new one on there.
I'll never forget it.
Oh, I'm not the right already about that one. I've never seen that, but typically the other, so you got the Japanese, the Chinese, et cetera, et cetera. But the gypsies are a new one.
It's a new one.
One more question.
You mentioned creating opportunities in higher education. I'm just wondering, where do you think higher education is going to go in the future? It seems unattainable for so many people. It's gotten so expensive, it's ridiculous. And I've even heard liberals bashing higher education, saying it's just not worth it. You can't get jobs, so why go? I mean, I can think of a ton of arguments. Why
You're
go?
absolutely right. There are huge issues with access to higher education on all kinds of levels. One that you mentioned, the cost, I mean, it's staggering. And kids have to get into debt, right? And we know what the loan situation for so many students has gotten out of control. I think, first and foremost, it's still an avenue of opportunity, right? I don't think it's the same that that resonated a generation ago, but it's still true that a degree, higher education degree, is going to put you in a position to gain more opportunity. I think colleges and universities really have to take apart the nature of the funding. It's harder for the public institutions, like in the state of California, that the state, you know, as you may or may not know, over the last two generations has dramatically defunded the level of funding to higher education, which makes it then you raise tuition and fees, right? Those of us that went to the University of California system a long time ago, it was almost free when we were young people. Right? It was, I think, $80 a quarter when Susan and I started, and George and Karen, you remember how cheap it was? That's not true anymore, right? And then a private university like Stanford, I think it's $93,000 a year. But maybe, but you know, one good thing for the richer private institutions like Stanford, they've done some remarkable things. If you make under $150,000 a year, if your child gets in, it's free, you don't pay anything. If you make a little higher, so it's graduated based on income, because they know most people can't pay that. But it's an issue. It's an issue that I think is not going to go away. And it takes citizens to argue. There have got to be ways, especially for our kids that are coming from poorer backgrounds. That's out of the question for them financially, right? And how do we change that so that that they can have an expectation that college can be for them too, and it's going to help them, right? So it's really a big question, a complicated question. Well, look, everyone, thank you for coming tonight.